Woman forced to burn her house down after her hoarding habit got out of hand.
But before we start, please make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and smash that like button. We really appreciate your continuous support.
When Kevin Burns moved to California, he was excited for a new adventure. He couldn't wait to embrace life in the Sunshine State. It would mean regularly hanging out on the beach, surfing the waves, and making new friends and neighbors. He was looking forward to a fresh start. However, things wouldn't end up going entirely to plan, and he'd soon learn that even the towns that seem perfect on the outside have their own secrets. Not long after settling into his new neighborhood, Burns came across something a little strange. There was an older woman who owned a house across the street from him, but instead of living inside it, she lived in her car. He couldn't understand why she'd do this when her house was right there. It wouldn't be long before Burns would get to the bottom of this puzzle, but what he found was shocking. When Kevin Burns first arrived at his house in California, he was convinced the house across the street was abandoned. It wasn't until about a year later that he realized this elderly woman was living in her car right in front of it. He'd obviously not yet spoken to her, but decided she probably wanted to be left alone. Burns couldn't help but wonder about this woman. He wanted an explanation for her behavior. He spoke to some of his neighbors who said the woman was called Ruth and she owned the house she slept in front of but never stepped foot inside it. Burns wasn't at all satisfied with this explanation. He decided something needed to be done. One day, he approached her to ask her if she needed anything at all. Little did he know that he wouldn't only become her best friend as a result, but also her hero. One morning after an unusually cold night, Burns headed over to Ruth's car. She was awake and seemed more than happy to engage in conversation with him. This would be the start of a lovely friendship, and from that day on, Burns would regularly stop by the car for a chat. He began to learn more about this strange woman. As they chatted, Ruth became more and more open about her life and told him about her daily routine. She woke each morning, headed to the local gym, and used their shower. As a result of her situation, she ate exclusively fast food, and after dinner, she'd fall asleep in the car in front of her house. Ruth didn't explain why she'd been sleeping in the car, and Burns didn't want to overstep, but he knew something wasn't right. One morning, Burns decided to get a closer look at Ruth's house. What he discovered shocked him. He found many broken windows, boards, and blinds, and a lot of mold. It was as if the house hadn't been lived in for years. It was a wreck. Burns wondered whether what Ruth needed was some help in restoring it. The more closely he examined the house, the more he discovered and soon came to the conclusion this house hadn't been lived in for a very long time. He wondered whether perhaps wildlife had taken over. When Burns discovered the truth, though, it broke his heart. It was a day like any other. Kevin Burns was on his way to Ruth's car to have their daily chat, but when he arrived, he found his friend in tears. When Burns asked her what was wrong, Ruth couldn't answer. She was frantically looking for something among the many plastic bags she had in her car. Whatever it was she was looking for, the search seemed utterly futile. Ruth explained to Kevin that she'd lost something that was very important to her. She told him that when she'd first moved into the car, she'd gathered up everything that was valuable and packed it all into plastic bags. She realized that she must have left this item inside the house, but she had no intention of ever stepping foot inside again. Burns tried asking Ruth what it was she'd lost, but Ruth couldn't seem to find the words to tell him. She seemed completely heartbroken. All she could manage to say was "in the house" over and over again while she pointed to her neglected home. All of a sudden, Ruth had an idea. "Maybe you can go inside and get it," she said. Despite still not knowing what it was he'd actually be looking for, Burns agreed. Little did he know what he was about to discover. After Burns agreed, Ruth was finally able to find the words to tell him that she was crying because she lost a picture of her parents. She believed that the last time she'd seen this photograph was inside the house in one of the bedrooms. Burns approached the house feeling confident he'd be able to find it. The task would actually turn out to be one of the most difficult in his life. As Kevin Burns approached the front door of the house, he started to understand why it was that Ruth had abandoned her home. There was a cracked window next to the front door, so he could just about see inside, and what he saw didn't look good at all. He couldn't see much since there was a complete lack of light, but what he did get a glimpse of didn't look good. The home seemed to be in complete disrepair, and it looked as though animals might as well have taken over. As he moved closer, he started to smell something foul emanating from inside the house. He was finally close enough to the house to understand why Ruth wasn't able to live here anymore. The conditions were appalling. There was a huge hole in the roof, and pieces of it were all over the floor of the house and the yard. Kevin took one last breath of fresh air before reluctantly stepping inside the house. When Kevin opened the front door of the house, the mountain of rubbish came pouring into the front lawn. There was so much of it that Kevin had to quickly jump out of the way, and the smell that came with it was so awful it made him gag. At this point, he contemplated turning back, but he couldn't let Ruth down. The home was completely uninhabitable. Everywhere he looked, he was confronted by piles and piles of rubbish. It covered the entire floor. Burns was struggling to breathe due to the stench, and his eyes even started watering. The task of finding the photograph that he thought would be easy now seemed near impossible. He'd been in the house less than 5 minutes, but already he had to run outside to prevent from throwing up. He walked back over to Ruth and told her he'd return to find the photograph after a quick breather. He realized how huge a task he had on his hands. It would require gloves and a mask, and he'd need to take the day off work. At this point, most people would have given up and refused to go back inside, but not Kevin. He was someone who stuck to his promises. He also wanted to find out exactly what had happened for the house to be in this mess, and he'd soon find out. Kitted out with gloves and a heavy-duty mask, Burns returned to the house to finish the task he'd started. With the appropriate equipment, he would be able to take over finding the photograph. Each room that Burns entered was worse than the last. The kitchen was filled with piles of trash, rotten food, and dirty dishes. He couldn't see the floor for all the rubbish. It was clear Ruth hadn't stepped foot inside the house for months. Burns' mission wasn't going too well, and he couldn't see any photographs that were worth picking up. Where could Ruth have left it? When he reached the living room, he couldn't believe his eyes. The living room was the worst room in the house, no question. Everywhere Burns looked, there were piles of trash bags, papers, and other strange items. It made total sense now why Ruth lived in her car. It was a better option than her home. Looking around at the chaos, Kevin feared it would take him hours to find the photo. Over 3 hours passed and he hadn't even come close to finding it. During that time, he couldn't help but wonder how Ruth even managed to accumulate this much trash. It was impressive, nearly. After hours of searching, Kevin came across an old box, like a little treasure chest. Thankfully, it had the photo that he needed. Kevin had come across Ruth's treasured box of memorabilia. Inside the box was not only the missing photo but also some sentimental items, including a diploma and trophy. The photo in question was clearly very old since it was faded, and it showed Ruth's parents as young lovers. While this box of goodies was interesting, Kevin was more drawn to an old bookcase standing in the living room. Behind the old bookcase, Burns noticed a crack. Upon examining this closely, he discovered to his delight there was a gaping hole in the wall, which was actually a doorway to a hidden room. His intrigue got the better of him, and he pushed the shelves aside in order to get a closer look. What he found was shocking. As Burns entered the secret room, his mind raced with questions. Was this the only hidden room, or were there others? Were there more secrets Ruth had been keeping? Burns had to know more, so he entered the secret room. When Burns stepped inside it, he realized he was in what had previously been a bedroom. He started to have some much darker thoughts. Had someone been held hostage in this room? Maybe Ruth? There were cobwebs everywhere. It was as if he entered a horror movie. One thing Burns did notice was that while he was covered head to toe in dust and cobwebs, there was a lot less trash in this room. Despite this, the room still smelled awful. The stale air almost suffocated Burns even through his mask. Burns inspected the dust-covered photographs and then looked above him, and what he saw was horrifying. A thick layer of mold covered the bedroom ceiling. It had grown so thick that the paint had flaked off and fallen onto the floor below. Burns quickly evacuated the room, knowing it wouldn't be good for him to ingest the air. While there was still more to explore, Burns felt he needed to get out as soon as possible. He'd completed the mission of finding the photograph, so his job was done. When Burns returned to Ruth, he confronted her about what he'd just seen. He had to say something. He told Ruth that her house had become a death trap, and she responded saying, "I had no idea it had gotten so bad." Ruth agreed to call a specialist and have the house professionally cleaned, but Burns and Ruth's story wasn't over yet. The worst was yet to come. Ruth would soon need her neighbor more than ever. Burns decided against telling Ruth that he discovered the secret room. He wanted to wait until the specialists arrived. Ruth had enough on her plate already, and after taking a look inside, the specialists told Kevin and Ruth the house was a hazard to the neighbors. The expert had actually said it was the worst case of mold he'd ever seen. He even suggested the house be demolished. It was clear this needed to happen, and it did, but in the most dramatic way possible. The specialists explained to Ruth and Kevin that the mold was so dire they wouldn't be able to touch it. That's how dangerous it was. Worse still, they explained that even the most advanced mold removal techniques wouldn't be able to prevent this mold from spreading further still. There was only one thing for it. They'd have to get the fire department involved. Why firefighters, you might ask? Well, they needed the firefighters to set the house ablaze. The expert said that the best way to deal with the situation was to burn the entire house to the ground. The challenge for the firefighters was to control the fire so it wouldn't spread beyond the house. Before they could set the house on fire, they needed to remove the objects that could catch on fire and become hazardous. The cleaning crew did this with the help of Burns. Most things were covered in mold and had to be taken to the dump. Ruth couldn't hold on to anything in the house. This was probably good, though, considering her hoarding tendencies. On the day the house was due to be burnt down, the crew went inside to check it over one last time, and Ruth seemed completely calm. While Ruth was obviously sad the home she'd called her own for decades was about to be destroyed, she felt it was definitely time to move on. This was an opportunity for her to start fresh and kick her terrible hoarding habit. Ruth now had the comfort of her new friend Kevin Burns to help her along the way too. Ruth said a tearful goodbye to her home as the firefighters prepared to burn it down once and for all. As she walked away from her property for the last time, she decided now was the time to reveal to Burns the truth behind the secret room he discovered. Ruth had everything she'd ever need inside her car, all thanks to Burns. As the fire started and the house began to burn, Ruth explained the sad truth about the bedroom Burns had seen. Tears streaming down her face, she explained, "That room was where my husband passed away. I didn't have the heart to go in there after he was gone." Upon hearing the story, Burns' heart went out to his new friend, and for a split second, he considered whether Ruth could quickly head back to the house to say a final goodbye. The moment had almost definitely passed and the house was starting to collapse. The firefighters had to stand by for a full 24 hours in order to ensure that neither the fire nor the embers spread to the other houses or trees. As all this played out, Burns wondered what Ruth's next move would be. As the decades had passed following the untimely death of her husband, Ruth had turned to hoarding to distract her. This was caused by the anxiety she suffered after losing the love of her life. With all the items she'd hoarded gone, she had the opportunity to start over. Ruth felt that she was far too old to start a new life. Where would she go and what would she do? Would she live the rest of her days out in the car? Burns had a better idea. With the help of his friends, he found a nearby community for senior citizens where she could go and get the help she needed. The community was more than happy to accommodate Ruth. She was still suffering immensely from the death of her husband, but up until that point, there hadn't been anyone with whom she could have talked to about it. This was about to change, however. There were plenty of people living in the community who could help her deal with the grief properly. Ruth's life had finally been transformed. She'd gone from living alone in a car to having a proper roof over her head and people all around her. She was also able to get more exercise and eat healthier food. Burns stayed in touch with her and went to see her regularly. Kevin's curiosity and kind-hearted nature had changed Ruth's life forever. If he hadn't followed his instincts, all of this would have never happened, and Ruth owed her newfound happiness to him. She would never, ever forget it.